The Grandeurs of Despair, Part 1. Nothing came yet. The clock of Saint Mary had struck 10. Enjolras and Combeferre had sat down, carbine in hand, near the opening of the great barricade. They were not talking, they were listening, seeking to catch even the faintest and most distant sound of a march. A headlong rung startled the empty street. They saw a creature nimbler than a clown climb over the omnibus, and Gavroche bounded into the barricade, all breathless, saying, "My musket! Here they are!" An electric thrill ran through the whole barricade, and a moving of hands feeling for their muskets was heard. "Do you want my carbine?" said Enjolras to the gamin. "I want the big musket," answered Gavroche, and he took Javert's musket. 43 insurgents, among them Enjolras, Combeferre, Courfeyrac, Busset, Joly, Bahorel, and Gavroche, were on their knees in the great barricade, their heads even with the crest of the wall, the barrels of their muskets and their carbines pointed over the paving stones, as through loopholes, watchful, silent, ready to fire. 6, commanded by Foy, were stationed with their muskets at their shoulders, in the windows of 2 upper stories of Corinth. A few moments more elapsed. Then a sound of steps, measured, heavy, numerous, was distinctly heard from the direction of Saint-Lô. This sound, at first faint, then distinct, then heavy and sonorous, approached slowly, without halt, without interruption, with a tranquil and terrible continuity. Nothing but this could be heard. It was at once the silence and the sound of the statute of the commander. But this stony tread was so indescribably enormous and so multiplex that it called up at the same time the idea of a throng and of a spectre. There was still a pause, as if on both sides they were awaiting. Suddenly, from the depth of that shadow, a voice, so much the more ominous because nobody could be seen, and because it seemed as if it was the obscurity itself which was speaking, cried, "Who's there?" At the same time, they heard the click of the levelled muskets. Enjolras answered in a lofty and ringing tone, "French Revolution!" "Fire!" said the voice. A flash empurpled all the facades on the street, as if the door of a furnace were opened and suddenly closed. A fearful explosion burst over the barricade. The red flag fell. The volley had been so heavy and so dense that it had cut the staff, that is to say, the very point of the pole of the omnibus. Some balls, which ricocheted from the cornices of the house, entered the barricade and wounded several men. The impression produced by this first charge was freezing. The attack was impetuous, and such as to make the boldest ponder. It was evident that they had to do with a whole regiment at least. "Comrades," cried Courfeyrac, "don't waste the powder. Let us wait to reply until they come into the street." "And first of all," said Enjolras, "let us hoist the flag again." He picked up the flag, which had just fallen at his feet. They heard from without the rattling of the ramrods in the muskets. The troops were reloading. Enjolras continued, "Who is there here who has courage? Who replants the flag on the barricade?" Nobody answered. To mount the barricade at that moment, when without doubt it was aimed at anew, was simply death. The bravest hesitates to sentence himself. Enjolras himself felt a shudder. He repeated, "Nobody volunteers?" Part 2. Since they had arrived at Corinth, and had commenced building the barricade, hardly any attention had been paid to Father Mabeuf. Monsieur Mabeuf, however, had not left the company. He had entered the ground floor of the wine shop, and sat down behind the counter. There he had been, so to speak, annihilated in himself. He no longer seemed to look or to think. Courfeyrac and others had accosted him 2 or 3 times, warning him of the danger, entreating him to withdraw, but he had not appeared to hear them. When nobody was speaking to him, his lips moved as if he was answering somebody, and as soon as anybody addressed a word to him, his lips became still, and his eyes lost all appearance of life. Some hours before the barricade was attacked, he had taken a position which he had not left since, his hands upon his knees, and his head bent forward, as if he were looking into an abyss. Nothing had been able to draw him out of this attitude. It appeared as if his mind were not in the barricade. When everybody had gone to take his place for the combat, there remained in the basement room only Javert tied to the post, an insurgent with drawn sabre watching Javert, and he, Mabeuf. At the moment of the attack, at the discharge, the physical shock reached him, and, as it were, awakened him. He rose suddenly, crossed the room, and at the instant when Enjolras repeated his appeal, "Nobody volunteers," they saw the old man appear in the doorway of the wine shop. His presence produced some commotion in the group. A cry arose. "It is the voter! It is the conventionist! It is the representative of the people. It is probable that he did not hear. He walked straight to Enjolras. The insurgents fell back before him with a religious awe. He snatched the flag from Enjolras, who drew back petrified. And then, nobody daring to stop him or aid him, this old man of 80, with shaking head but firm foot, began to climb slowly up the stairway of paving stones built into the barricade. It was so gloomy and so grand that all about him cried, "Hats off!" At each step it was frightful. His white hair, his decrepit face, his large forehead bald and wrinkled, his hollowed eyes, his quivering and open mouth, his old arm raising the red banner, surged up out of the shadow and grew grand in the bloody light of the torch. And they seemed to see the ghost of '93 rising out of the earth, the flag of terror in its hand. When he was on the top of the last step, when this trembling and terrible phantom, standing upon that mound of rubbish before 1,200 invisible muskets, rose up, in the face of death, and as if he were stronger than it, the whole barricade had in the darkness a supernatural and colossal appearance. There was one of those silences which occur only in presence of prodigies. In the midst of this silence, the old man waved the red flag and cried, "Vive la Révolution! Vive la République! Fraternity, equality, and death!" They heard from the barricade a low and rapid muttering, like the murmur of a hurried priest dispatching a prayer. It was probably the commissary of police who was making the legal summons at the other end of the street. Then the same ringing voice, which had cried, "Who is there?" cried, "Disperse!" Monsieur Mabeuf, pallid, haggard, his eyes illumined by the mournful fires of insanity, raised the flag above his head and repeated, "Vive la République!" "Fire!" said the voice. A second discharge, like a shower of grape, beat against the barricade. The old man fell upon his knees, then rose up, let the flag drop, and fell backward upon the pavement within, like a log, at full length with his arms crossed. Streams of blood ran from beneath him. His old face, pale and sad, seemed to behold the sky. One of those emotions superior to man, which make us forget even to defend ourselves, seized the insurgents, and they approached the corpse with a respectful dismay. "What men these regicides are," said Enjolras. Courfeyrac bent over to Enjolras' ear. "This is only for you, and I don't wish to diminish the enthusiasm, but he was anything but a regicide. I knew him. His name was Father Mabeuf. I don't know what ailed him today, but he was a brave blockhead. Just look at his head." "Blockhead and Brutus' heart," answered Enjolras. Then he raised his voice. "Citizens, this is the example which the old give to the young. We hesitated, he came. We fell back, he advanced. Behold, what those who tremble with old age teach those who tremble with fear. This patriarch is august in the sight of the country. He had a long life and a magnificent death. Now let us protect his corpse. Let everyone defend this old man dead as he would defend his father living. And let this presence among us make the barricade impregnable." A murmur of gloomy and determined adhesion followed these words. Enjolras stooped down, raised the old man's head, and timidly kissed him on the forehead. Then, separating his arms and handling the dead with tender care, as if he feared to hurt him, he took off his coat, showed the bleeding holes to all, and said, "There, now, is our flag." Part 3. They threw a long black shawl belonging to the widow Hucheloup over Father Mabeuf. 6 men made a barrow of their muskets, and they laid the corpse upon it, and they bore it bareheaded with solemn slowness to the large table in the basement room. These men, completely absorbed in the grave and sacred thing that they were doing, no longer thought of the perilous situation in which they were. When the corpse passed near Javert, who was still impassible, Enjolras said to the spy, "You, directly." During this time, little Gavroche, who was alone, had not left his post, and had remained on the watch, thought he saw some men approaching the barricade with stealthy step. Suddenly he cried, "Take care!" Courfeyrac, Enjolras, Jean Prouvaire, Combeferre, Joly, Bahorel, Busset, all sprang tumultuously from the wine shop. There was hardly a moment to spare. They perceived a sparkling breath of bayonets undulating above the barricade. Municipal guards of tall stature were penetrating, some by climbing over the omnibuses, others by the opening, pushing before them the gamin who fell back but did not fly. The moment was critical. It was that first fearful instant of the inundation, when the stream rises to the level of the bank, and when the water begins to infiltrate through the fissures in the dike. A second more, and the barricade had been taken. Barrel sprang upon the first municipal guard, who entered, and killed him at the very muzzle of his carbine. The second killed Barrel with his bayonet. Another had already prostrated Courfeyrac, who was crying, "Help!" The largest of all, a kind of colossus, marched upon Gavroche with a fixed bayonet. The gamin took Javert's enormous musket in his little arms, aimed it resolutely at the giant, and pulled the trigger. Nothing went off. Javert had not loaded his musket. The municipal guard burst into a laugh, and raised his bayonet over the child. Before the bayonet touched Gavroche, the musket dropped from the soldier's hands. A ball had struck the municipal guard in the middle of the forehead, and he fell on his back. A second ball struck the other guard, who had assailed Courfeyrac, full in the breast, and threw him upon the pavement. It was Marius, who had just entered the barricade.